Welcome to the Propaganda Report. This is Monica Perez.
And I'm Brad Binkley.
In these corona times, I think many of us are wondering how we got so coweringly dependent for every necessity of life on a system totally beyond our control. I recall a gun rights advocate once say, "You may someday have no hope but prayer for a good guy with a gun to come secure your home. But I never imagined that someday I might have nothing more than a prayer to secure my next meal." Well, our guest today did imagine that and has been doing something about it. From exploring his materials ever since I first heard of him, I find a simple description eludes me. So I'm going to go with the easiest label. He is a green anarchist, but so much more, and we're going to dig into all of it. So without further ado, let me introduce Bellamy Fitzpatrick. Bellamy, welcome.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you for your time. I imagine you're a very busy person in every way, both in how you conduct your life and how you share your message and insights with people who, like me, who was one of those situations I always knew that there are whole ways of thinking I never even thought of, like just whole big picture things. And when you were on Pete Quinonez's podcast, and I had just read, I never even thought of reading Ted Kaczynski's manifesto. And then they did some Netflix thing. They were talking about it, and he put out a book recently, kind of probably rehash of that. It included the manifesto called Technological Slavery. I don't know what possessed me to buy it. And then I bought it and I was like, oh, wow, I get it. And that would explain why my efforts to kind of promote liberty and restore the Bill of Rights, it just feels kind of hopeless. We've moved beyond that. And then Pete said, you should listen to Bellamy Fitzpatrick. I just did a podcast with him, and then I just had to pick your brain myself. But I don't think my listeners really know too much about green anarchy or kind of where you're coming from or why. Even that, for me, identifying technology as the problem was a big leap, and it was recent. So I just wonder if you could give us a little bit about your background, what a green anarchist is, and kind of what's your bigger philosophy, maybe what you're doing.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'm not sure how to unpack that.
It's too much. That would be the whole hour. I'm not saying anything else the entire time.
Well, I unpacked a bit of my story on Pete's podcast, and I'm not sure how much your audiences overlap, and I would hate to be redundant and talk about myself a lot. So I guess I'll just say I'm someone who... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Feel free to, give us anything. It doesn't matter. It's this kind of stuff. It was so new to me that hearing it twice would be a benefit.
Okay, sure. So I'm someone who... I think like a lot of people, I was drawn to radical politics through early experiences. So grew up with a, somewhat dysfunctional family. I loved them very much, but there were problems in the home, and the police got involved at various points. So I think at an early stage of life, I was sort of inoculated with this idea that the state can be an adversarial force and that it's not just there to help you and, secure your safety and so forth. And eventually seeing the little bit of forest around my home clear cut at a young age, I was very troubled and disturbed by that and wondered, why are these things happening to the natural world around me? Why are these things happening to my family? And then as I became a teenager, I became more and more troubled by what seemed like a kind of world system that was just devouring nature. And it was only a few years later that I became more able to kind of piece it together into the beginnings of a cohesive worldview. I would say around the age of 19 was when I started calling myself an anarchist generally. And then a few years after that, I got more and more into the green tendency. And part of that came out of experiences doing various kinds of, I guess, what I would call normative left activist kind of stuff, and very quickly seeing the limits of that and how so much of it was aimed at really petitioning this ruling system to accommodate you better. And even when that activism involved more superficially adversarial tactics, like, street protests that edge into being riots or blocking things, and these sort of normal activisty things of, chaining yourself to something or something like that. It's still, when you got past that kind of superficial oppositional nature, you're still basically asking the state, this bureaucracy, these corporate forces to change on behalf of your begging. And so I quickly got frustrated with that and got more into green anarchism, which I guess, if I were to put it in a phrase, would just be anarchism that, if you consider anarchism an ethical system that then leads to a particular political view, I would call green anarchism doing that, but in a way that really looks at ecology and technology as fundamental components of that. And I think you can trace it. You can trace it way back, because you see there are various ancient thinkers in the West and elsewhere who were concerned with the role of technology. You see that in, for example, the ancient Taoists. You see it in Plato, actually. You see it in the Stoics. But I guess I would say the modern tendency really got going with people like Henry David Thoreau and Leo Tolstoy. Thoreau and Tolstoy, both anarchists of a kind, I would say, and who were not just concerned with political authority, but kind of the feeling-toned fabric of life. What does everyday life look like? What are your relationships? Are they with living beings, or are they with these kind of unnatural settings that we create for ourselves? Tolstoy, being a Christian, was very enamored of voluntary simplicity and this kind of immediacy of life experience that meant eschewing technology to a certain degree. You also see the 19th century geographer and anarchist Elisée Reclus, who was really, I think, one of the first modern Western people to be talking about what we would now call bioregionalism. So this idea that different ways of life are suitable to different local ecologies, and we should actually be thinking about how to integrate ourselves with the ecology around us and not just have this sort of standardized industry-driven way of life that is papering over the relationships with the organisms in our immediate environment.
May I? Yeah, I
yes,
think
please.
With that,
I'm just going to keep
wonder.
going.
Yeah, no, I could. I could literally. I do listen to your stuff. Like, I will listen to you for hours without saying anything, because I do. But I think I just wanted to point out something that I notice a lot. Two things. One is that it seems to me that the biology, the bioregionalism, see, this is the thing I'm trying to reconcile. I'm a libertarian, hardcore libertarian, very black and white kind of libertarian, but it's not that I'm closed-minded about it. I will, I get this, and I'm beginning to think beyond this with it, because it goes to what you were saying about when you're chaining yourself to a tree, you're just begging. And I feel like I've been thinking about what to do, how to restore justice, sanity, whatever within the system. And I think the system has grown beyond that, being able to constrain it. But I feel like as a libertarian, I still don't want to use force or a higher level of organization in order to solve these problems. And the bioregionalism thing makes me think back at what maybe the emergence of culture as a reflection of the geography and the geology around them. Yeah. And that's how that actually the civilization, the technology, the pushing down of an overarching control structure onto that was what went wrong. So for me, I'm as a libertarian, how do you get people to respect the environment without forcing them? But it's kind of, in a way, looking to that the system, the overlay is a mistake, is a corruption of maybe the dual nature of man, whatever. It's just a purely materialistic power structure that's put over what the natural relationships would be. And so it's easier for me to reconcile the libertarian thing when you look at what like closer to our natural organization would look like by looking back. So I like the bioregionalism idea, but I wonder how to get forward. What did you want to say, Binkley?
I have a question about something that you said. You said that, I think you were you saying that you got frustrated with corporate type of activism?
Frustrated, I guess, with the sort of normal left activism, like doing these protests, doing these blockades of things, doing these this kind of standard stuff from anything from campus activism to kind of big organizations it just I was doing that for a few years in a fairly involved way, and every time I just thought this is going nowhere for one reason or another. It would be obvious to me that it wasn't really going to go anywhere.
That's interesting. We cover a lot of that stuff and notice that it is often controlled from the top, and then the goalposts are often shifted about what the goals are to kind of string the activists along.
Yes, I think that's exactly right.
I saw that in action when the students kept protesting austerity in Europe, and at the same time I was protesting Obamacare, and some tourist on a train in DC said to me, "What's all this ruckus about?" And I said, "Well, you know how you guys go out on the street and beg for an end to austerity and more government spending? We're actually fighting to have more, having less of it." And that's when it started to occur to me, like, those people, the best argument for more liberty is, in the big sense of the word, is that with the state, really, you can't even like vote with your dollars. You can't vote with your feet. You just have to beg.
Yeah, to beg and to vote and to really just play this role in one way or another that is giving legitimacy to the state, right? Whether you vote or you protest, either way, you're reifying and emphasizing the idea that these are the masters of your life, and you relate to them in various ways, but it's always about getting them to do something for you. And
yes, they frame it and set the terms.
Yeah.
So I have a question, though, that relates to that from the Kaczynski stuff. And I know it sounds scared, like, oh, Ted Kaczynski. I just finished I'm almost finished with the biography, Harvard and the Unabomber, just to kind of put my feet on the ground. Like, you have to separate out his thoughts with his actions, his own psychological problems. But his thoughts, and he admits himself in his manifesto that they're not original, and he cites references and stuff, but he really writes them very well in a way that's very accessible. So I found it helpful to refer to what he is saying, and a little harder to get through like Ellul. And thank you very much for the Scribner recommendation. Sure. It's going to take me some time. Yeah. But what Kaczynski said is basically that, I think, if I'm not getting it wrong, that technology runs the show, and that we all pivot to technology. I think it's an Ellul concept, and that we serve technology. And Kaczynski extrapolated to where it might end up. And he said it could end up where machines are needed to run machines, or people run machines, or whatever. But ultimately, it's going to get too complicated even for us to control it. And I'm not sure I understood him 100% right, but my question is it looks to me that technology, and I can see it because I read about Rockefeller Foundation, about the World Economic Forum, I read their white papers, I read their own manifestos, and they talk about using technology. They say it's to serve man, but they are actively, expressly pushing and promoting technology. And I think it's clear in the Corona times that is what they are doing. And it's as if they are using it to they want to use it to control the world. But do you think that they will lose control of it, or do they have a sense? I mean, this is really pushing it out there, but do you think that's right, that they are going to be able to control it? Is the hope that it gets out of their control, or what?
Yeah, it's a good question. And regarding the issues with the Rockefeller Foundation and so forth, that's something that I'm sure you know much more about than I, because I've only recently begun trying to study that sort of large scale globalization conspiracy sort of people. And I haven't studied it enough to really feel confident to voice any opinions about it. I do think that people like Kaczynski and Jacques Ellul, they do tend to really emphasize this idea that sort of human intentions and actions are secondary to technology. And I think at times they sort of overemphasize it, because we know enough now. I mean, you and I were talking before the recording started that there are these large-scale agendas, and the elite do think on multi-generational terms, and they do orchestrate large events. And so I think there is a danger of kind of overplaying this technological determinism argument. But I do, and I'm actually writing a review of Jacques Ellul and David Skrbina's books, and one of my criticisms of Ellul in the review is that I think he sometimes overplays it. But I do think you can argue for a kind of modest technological determinism, because every time with large-scale industrial technology that requires whole societies to organize around it to make it work, you do have a kind of modest determinism in that every time you have a problem and you bring in some sort of new technological device to try to address that problem, it's always going to have secondary consequences. And those consequences are going to involve new problems. And then you have to sort of bring in new technology to address those. So just to make it a little bit concrete here, if you engage in mass agriculture that involves heavy tillage and the use of petrochemicals, because you say, oh, well, we have a food shortage, or we have inconsistent harvests or that sort of thing. So we're going to up the technology level of our agriculture, which is, the staff of life, right? The basic thing you need to have society. Well, once you start doing that, you're going to over time damage your soil. You're going to cause it to degrade and erode. Then you say, okay, well, now our soil is going to shit. I'm sorry, I should have asked you beforehand if cursing was okay. And
you can absolutely say
my virgin ears.
Okay.
I get to platform from time to
some
time.
people want to have a show that people can have their kids around and stuff. So,
yes. We'd be scaring the kids, but not bad words.
Yeah, sure. So then you say, okay, we need fertilizer. So then you're going to be extracting organic matter from somewhere else. You're going to be transporting it. So now you're depleting an ecosystem elsewhere where you're mining organic matter, or you're using petrochemicals, which are going to have toxic cascades. Now you need a transport network to bring that from point A to point B where your soil is depleted. And so you see it has this kind of cascading effect. So now you're dependent on petrochemicals. Well, that means you need to do mineral extraction somewhere. Wherever you do that mineral extraction, you're going to destroy the local habitat. If it's on someone else's land, then you're going to have to either bargain with them or aggress against them somehow. So you can see how the more you use, the more you need to use. And the same is not true with sort of pre-industrial human scale technology, where you're using natural materials. You have few or no non-biodegradable wastes. You can have all the technology needs met by smaller communities, rather than having to have this sort of vast infrastructure that requires the coordination of many human beings, which usually leads to the coercion and bureaucracy managing those many human beings and so forth. So to answer your question of will it get out of their control, is it out of their control? I mean, the elites still have to, by having such a large, complex world system, they do confine their own choices in a way, right? They have to, when you're at the top of a brutal hierarchy, your actions are sort of determined by that structure that you're acting in. And if you don't act in a certain way, you're going to be replaced or pounced upon.
I think they spend most of their effort making sure that status quo hierarchy stays in place, even though actually, with all this technology, it's almost like a contradiction in that by expanding all this technology, perhaps there needs to be maybe that would naturally arise into a different structure. But I've read the report from Iron Mountain is a great place to start for that they talk about how do you suppress the impact that nuclear weapons has on reducing war and still maintain this hierarchy that we sit atop that was built on war. So they don't talk about a new structure. They talk about maintaining their structure despite the technology that they introduced.
Right.
I have a quick question. I have a lot of questions. It's all very interesting. For this question, you talked about the technology, the relationships with people versus the relationships people have with technology. And right now, Monica alluded to this, that technology is being pushed on us hardcore right now. Virtual everything, virtual work, virtual school, virtual dating even. I'm seeing commercials for that. Graduating with robots or walking for you as your virtual face is on the robot.
I didn't see that. That's crazy.
What kind of impact do you think that it's like a merging of trying to your personal relationships through technology, which it's a different type of interaction. What kind of impact do you think that this is going to have on people and society just broadly?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and all of that stuff that you mentioned, it's disturbing to see how much of it is being accompanied by this really quite, from my point of view, heavy-handed mainstream media message where we keep seeing week after week in one or another of the mainstream news channels, this kind of, oh, we're not going back to normal, or maybe social distancing is here to stay, or and so there's that kind of problem, reaction, solution, and then normalization step, right?
Yeah.
And I think the effect on it is pretty clear. I mean, we see so many times these studies coming out, and this was before all the corona weirdness, about how Generation Z seems to be having the most problems in terms of suicide, in terms of teen depression. People have fewer friends than they used to. They spend less time with their friends than they used to. We have more people living alone. And when I am making these comments, I'm speaking specifically about the United States because that's what I know the most about. But I think you would find similar phenomena elsewhere. And in some ways, some of the East Asian societies like Japan are even ahead of us with a lot of this stuff. They have that mass hikikomori phenomenon. Are you familiar with this?
No.
They have this phenomenon where it's mostly men, but not entirely, people who live as self-isolating lives as they possibly can. It's hikikomori translates roughly to shut in, like being a shut-in. And so you have these people who they will not work, they will not leave their rooms unless they're forced to. They have these sort of fully online gaming lives, and they have the official figures are in the hundreds of thousands of people doing this. But I've heard from a number of Japanese people that I know personally who say it's much higher and that the government is underreporting it. So you have this mass psychological effect from the technology where depression is increasing. Suicide is the 8th highest cause of death in the United States. And I believe this is because of a kind of death of community. We have so much loneliness, and it gets in this reciprocal feedback loop with the technology. The lonelier you are, the more time you spend using it, doing this gaming or pornography or social networking. And then the more you do those things, the more depressed and you tend to become, and the more thin your relationships become. Many people in my generation, millennials, I can't recall the figure, unfortunately, but it's the highest generation to date of people who say they have not one close friend in whom they feel they can confide in about their problems. I mean, that's crazy.
Wow. Well, and I would layer on top of that, which I think was another thing, a Kaczynski concept, which was that as the system gets further and further away from the human capacity to contribute to it, the human being is stressed. So they have to augment the human being with antidepressant drugs to handle the stress. Yeah. Maybe even, implants. We all wear eyeglasses, is an easy way to see that. But they're going to put chips in your brain. That's going to be, the eyeglasses. And so I think that it's both things. It's that it's isolating and that has psychic damage, but also your work becomes something that you're barely able to do and still stay human.
Yeah. I mean, we evolved in a way to use our whole bodies. I mean, that's what's healthy for us, to be mobile, to be using our bodies as well as our minds, to be using all of our senses. And most people, their type of work does not involve that. I mean, many people have desk jobs, right? They are specifically not mobile all day. And in fact, they have to do that in order to make a living. And they are just using their eyes and their hands and their fingers, and of course their minds as well. But, this is a person who is going to end up developing chronic illnesses over time from being sedentary and from staring at a screen all the time. And I mean, why, as you said, why do so many of us need corrective lenses? It's because we're almost always using our near sight rather than far sight.
Yeah, I get on the computer for so long or on my phone, I gotta take a break. I gotta roll around the grass or something. I feel the effects of what you're saying. What was the name of that phenomenon again?
Hikikomori. It's I believe it's Hikk. I can't spell it in my head.
Okay, I just need the first few. I can find it.
Hikikomori. We'll find it.
That's interesting. That reminded me of this story I saw in Japan where a man married an anime character. And he invited his family.
Yeah, well, that makes sense then. I mean, that's what the Corona times are. That's what they're doing to us. And I was saying today on our show, I was like, I'm kind of getting used to it. Like, I literally am buying different kinds of clothes. Like, I'm just like, I'm not wearing jeans to sit around the house. Like, I mean, I'm starting to think, I was like, I can wear like those, roby things that gurus wear. You can just hang out because, on the one hand that could be healthy, but on the other hand, it might not be.
Pajama sales have skyrocketed. I saw that yesterday.
But, oh, really? But I would say one thing that I noticed with this sense of alienation, whatever, it starts sounding Marxist, but as a mom, I went to graduate school till I was. I know I can't. The person's ideas. Yeah, go ahead. You can't. That's okay with you. You're not going to be offended. But I went to graduate school till I was 30, and I was an investment banker and stuff like that. And something in me wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. I just always, since I was a little girl, wanted to be a mom, and so I really would never pursue that kind of a career because I wanted to stay home. And I noticed when I did stay home, maybe this is just me, maybe this isn't a universal phenomenon, but for me, I got so much more satisfaction out of setting my own schedule and keep it. I would even joke. I was like, I keep the cave clean. I roast the antelope. He kills the antelope. Nothing has changed at all. The dogs they alert and they keep the thing clean. And I felt a much greater sense of satisfaction. I started to realize why people would want to quote work for themselves or whatever, that kind of thing. And then I started to realize there is a certain primitive value and autonomy in what I'm doing that is highly connected to the value. I'm nurturing my offspring, and it feels right. And I feel the same thing about, people get so excited. They grow a single freaking tomato. It takes them a year and they're just like, I grew that. Let us honor and cherish this tomato. There's something about the satisfaction of doing something correct. And I just feel like that the antithesis is what we're all being directed into. And they have such a stranglehold over the mind of the youth. So one of the things I wanted to ask you is I'm coming around to what Pete Quinona said. He's no longer calling himself an anarchist. He's going to call himself or he has become an agorist, which I I don't know enough about it to actually label myself such, but I'm an aspiring agorist, I think. And I feel like, but maybe, I'm kind of too old to learn how to grow an avocado tree or wait for a pear tree to bear fruit. They say pear trees are for grandchildren. I don't know if you've ever heard that, but my kids are teenagers and they could walk the path that you're walking. But if you can't plug in an Xbox to that pear tree, you ain't getting my kid anytime soon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what's the awakening? You sound like you got awakened quite young, but do you see this whole Corona times thing as moving us in any kind of more like deeply greenly woke direction?
That is a good question. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, okay, well, I guess I don't know what camp you're in if you think the virus is a naturally occurring phenomenon as the official narrative is, or if you think that there was, that it escaped from the lab. Or
I'm even beyond any of that. I actually question the what we're told about viruses in general. And so from the very beginning of this thing, I was not really worried about it as killing 65 million people like the Event 201 scenario implied, because I think you have to be fundamentally weak to really get that sick from what they call a virus. So I don't think it came from a lab. I think that I think that there's a narrative that is not true around it, but I'm not like fundamentally fearful of the sickness.
Okay. Are you an HIV skeptic? Is this the...
My brother died of AIDS, they say, and he insisted it was AZT. He had no symptoms. He took AZT, and ever since then, I've noticed that I don't know anybody who died of AIDS who did not take AZT. So yes, I'm a bit of an HIV skeptic. I'm reading Peter Duesberg's book, Reinventing the AIDS Virus, right now.
Okay, I can't speak to any of this because it's not something I've studied. I do think that the idea of pandemics as a general phenomenon, whatever one thinks about this particular one, it is kind of an implicitly green anarchist friendly, so to speak, phenomenon, in that what many of us have been saying for years is this idea that you can't have this deeply unnatural way of life and this highly dense population centers and that sort of thing without eventually getting some kind of major blowback just as a result of ecological feedback. So,
well, I would like to say that I actually think that's closer to what I think AIDS is. That I think that these things that make us so sick are a function of the artificial environment. I don't think that it's a standalone microbial phenomenon. I think that we are weak and we are bombarded by these artificial things, and we're just not designed to deal with them. And we also are not nourished to guard against them. And we're not even, I don't think they're even being honest with us about it. And so we're doubly unarmed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you get these strange diseases like chronic fatigue syndrome, which, it's as if you're just sort of generally screwed up in your body, and you get these mental illnesses, like I said, depression before, and you have at least some set of people who come from this very materialist perspective who say, depression is just a problem with your brain chemistry. I mean, it's not a problem with your brain chemistry. It's that we are giving people a way of life that is bereft of meaning. We're giving people a way of life that doesn't actually meet the deepest human needs. And someone is reacting to that in this global psychological way, even if they don't know exactly what the problem is, even if they can't name it themselves. As for whether this will wake people up in the way that I would like it to, I don't know, because unfortunately, I'm seeing how much it's just like everything. It gets sucked into this culture wars narrative.
Yes.
And I think the culture wars narrative is one of the most powerful psychological weapons that the elite have. And it's as if there's almost nothing that can happen that maybe, I guess Jeffrey Epstein's death is one of the only recent events that kind of escaped the culture wars. Almost everything else just gets sucked into this vacuum of, one set of people are protesting. Well, those people are fascists and Trump supporters and they're going to get us all killed. And then, the flip side of it is, oh, you're afraid of the disease. Well, that's because you're some sort of sentimental wimp and so forth.
Lazy.
Yeah, and it just doesn't. It ruins the revelatory potential of these phenomena by just obfuscating them into, okay, you can have 2 or maybe 3 views about this, and it has to be tied to your political tribe,
And it's a brilliant way for them to cover up any contribution they make to the catastrophe by kind of owning this idea of hoax or conspiracy theory, putting things out there that touch on some of the truths in the theory that they were behind it. It's not, they basically advertise the fact, so it's barely theory, but then they take that and they assign that to one of the sides and put that next to a person with a swastika, and then you've got it's just a disaster. But before, I just want to say one thing. I read an article recently about how working in dirt is correlated with the reduced depression. So like if you don't want to take Prozac or allergic to Prozac, garden. And I just thought, yes, it's they're scratching that. Further study is needed, it said. I was like, I think we get it.
Yeah, I think one of the funniest things for me recently has been this, in a sort of new agey type circles and that kind of thing. This term has come out, forest bathing, which it's literally this idea of, oh, you go out in the woods and it will make you feel better. And the idea that this has to be understood as this niche health exercise that you can do for yourself, that to me shows how deeply, I'm going to use the word alienated, we are from the natural world, that you would think of, oh, I'm going to go do some forest bathing as if it's this eccentric, idiosyncratic activity that you do for your health rather than just being part of what it means to be a human being.
And I wonder too if that makes it quite elite in that I saw the same thing when I was growing up in New York, upstate New York. I'm from Rockland County, and behind my house, we weren't rich, we were poor, but like behind my little house was a lot of woods. And I can still see the woods behind my mother's house, but if you walk like 3 feet in, if it's in the winter, you can see that it's just all houses behind there now. And so when I was little, I could go into the woods, and we had would find old couches and drag them back there, and they're disgusting, but we had some kind of sense of that. But now it seems that anything that would be like large and foresty is land either owned by the government or by Warren Buffett, or there's these beauty strips that are just along the side that there's actually almost no way. And then the environmental movement, talk about like having the culture war, it makes it, I was raised to be a conservationist, is what my father would say. Not an environmentalist, but like to have that respect for God's creation, kind of. And it makes people immediately turn off who are on one side of the political spectrum or the other, that an environmentalist will call attention to they'll say we need more national parks. And because I don't trust the government, I don't really think that's the answer. I feel like that's taking everything actually offline. And what you need is a more decentralized ownership of this stuff. And I feel like we just don't, the upshot is I feel like we don't have access to forest bathing. It has to be a destination. It has to be a vacation. You have to make an appointment. You probably have to pay for it.
What they've done a little bit to prevent people from going out into nature, especially right now, is they're promoting stuff like virtual hiking trails, virtual rivers, experience nature virtually. Therefore, you don't have to actually go outside.
And don't forget
so you're just
murder
telling me
hornets.
worse things I didn't even know about.
Yeah, and there's murder hornets, and they're telling you that they had this argument if UV was good for you or bad for you. I understand people get skin cancer and need to use sunscreen. I get that. But I almost feel like you were saying, we think that the connection with nature, a pandemic is like a normal thing. I think vitamin D deficiency, telling us never to expose ourselves to the sun. I mean, it is, I don't believe it's an evil plot designed purely to make people depressed, miserable, and unhealthy. But if that's what they were after, they couldn't think of a better way to do it.
Right. And then you, not even in Corona times, just in so-called normal times, you have people buying vitamin D supplements and taking them. And you get this whole sort of health consumerism lifestyle among.
Yes. And does that even work? Like, I don't even know if that, I always heard it doesn't really work to just consume it like that. You have to, and then you're not even in outside. Like, part of it, it's not just the vitamin D, it's the fact that you want to go outside. But I'll tell you, the thing that upsets me the most in my entire life ever is the freaking chemtrails. Like, I cannot stand it. So I know you're not as conspiracy oriented as I am, but do you not recognize, or do you agree with me? It's kind of self-evident that they're spraying stuff in the skies.
It's not something I've ever looked into, and I can't speak to it.
Oh, okay. I would have thought that the aluminum raining down on your forest would mess up your... I'm serious. Like, they find aluminum like in soil everywhere, even though there's no explanation for it.
Yeah, I have 2 friends who insist to me that this is true. And it's something that when I first heard about it... So I assume that you believe that disinformation is put out there, right? I saw... Yeah,
like contrails is a cover-up for chemtrails.
Well, I saw on your Twitter feed that it looks like you think that the Plandemic documentary was disinfo. Okay. So I think...
Well, I think it was like a false flag thing. I think that I think she's not genuine. I think she deliberately went out there to make people who question the official narrative of COVID seem crazy and lying. That's what I think. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it was weird how they walked it back only a couple of days after letting the film get out there. Okay, so when I first heard about the chemtrails thing, I quickly assumed, okay, this is just sort of bullshit that gets sprayed at us either intentionally or it's just stuff that kind of bubbles up from people's general paranoia. And I think it's reasonable that people are experiencing paranoia because we're lied to all the time.
Yep.
But I didn't pay any attention to it. And then the past couple of years, I had 2 friends say, oh, no, you need to look into this. It's really real. So I guess I will just say I have no opinion about it because I don't know. So.
Yeah, it's been only a couple of years. I felt the same way. I was like, that is crazy stuff. It's HARP, whatever. You say that stuff, you sound crazy. I'm not buying that. And I just could not deny what was like you could watch the sky. And then as soon as the Corona Times thing happened, I was like, just check out the sky and see if everything's greener and bluer, and it has been. And it seems obvious to me now, but it's taken a couple of years for it to just sink in. But I figured it would impact your actual way of life.
Monica mentioned your forest. I don't assume she was being literal in that, but...
What's permaculture?
Yeah. Do you live are you a survivalist out in the woods type of thing going on?
No. It's more like I guess... Probably the best term for it would be like homesteading.
Okay.
So I live on a piece of land in upstate New York, and so we're doing a permaculture approach to kind of. Are you familiar with the term agroforestry?
I am not.
So basically, we're growing a substantial amount of our own food, and over time it will increase because rather than being focused on annual crops, I mean, we do grow annuals, but rather than doing something where you're doing annual monoculture where it's like you have a whole series of rows of kale plants and then you have a whole series of rows of carrots and so forth, it's more like it looks a little bit more wild. So things are sort of growing polyculturally. And we're also quite focused on perennials rather than annuals. So rather than plants that grow for a season and then you harvest them and that's it, these are plants that grow for many years. So things like chestnut trees, hazelnuts, hickory nuts, walnuts, persimmons, pears, apples, plums, mulberries, and then perennial vegetables like Turkish rocket, good King Henry, sunchokes, valerian, stinging nettle. And the idea is that by growing these perennials, you are actually building soil over time rather than having to do tillage. And you have a, how do I put this? You have a system that builds on itself over time rather than needing regular inputs of human, I mean, there is human labor, but when you're growing annuals, there's a lot more labor input and energy input because you have to do it year after year after year rather than, okay, I am growing a tree. When I first plant it, it's very vulnerable and it needs a lot of care. But then once it reaches a certain size, it pretty much takes care of itself. And then as it grows larger, you're getting larger and larger yields from it. And so I guess I would say permaculture, it's kind of like, it's one of these words like anarchism where, everyone wants to kind of define it a particular way. And just like with anarchism, it's kind of an umbrella term for a lot of different tendencies. I would say permaculture is kind of like that too. But if I had to put it briefly, I would say it's an ecological design schema that's based on thinking in whole systems rather than in parts, and combining traditional knowledge from various cultures, whether indigenous cultures or traditional agriculture societies, and combining that with modern scientific knowledge and also a set of ethics relating to the biosphere that lead you to creating food and fuel systems and designing shelters in a way that mimics and meshes with the local ecology and ultimately the biosphere as a whole, rather than so much of what we do now, which is basically resisting that. And
I was going to...
Go ahead.
Yeah. God. I was going to ask you if it extended to like the structures that you live in. And I noticed this. I walk around and I think about it. I've been to England a few times and I've seen structures that say like built in 1647. And it occurred to me, it's like, we really should only have to build stuff for the extra people. Like we're tearing stuff down and rebuilding it all the time. It just, in a community, you should really have so much surplus, such leisure time. But of course, I think that things like government built infrastructure, suppressed and subsidized interest rates, tax incentives, create all these incentives to tear stuff down and build it up again. For two reasons. One, I think that it destroys culture, which they like because it keeps us looking up to them instead of at each other. But also just if you want to think from a venal point of view, transactions are where they can skim. If you're not making any transactions, if you're using all of your surplus in leisure, they can't take a piece of that. But if you're using it in consumption, they get some of that.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. And I agree with you that there's a multi-generational effort to destroy culture, to destroy anything that really is outside of the state corporate complex, because the more you have of so-called civic society, the more you have relations with your environment. As you said, it's as if anywhere that they can't get in, they see as threatening.
I noticed I was reading this book about LBJ, who's just universally held as a bad guy. The book was too long. I'm not even interested in him.
I started the Path to Power?
It could be. It's like 2 volumes, right? It was so huge and everybody raved about it. So I was trying to plow through it, but life was too short. I got through some of it though. And in the beginning it was like, he was a complete piece of crap, whatever. But he did reach into these rural communities where people basically didn't have shoes and sat off the porch with their inbred kids and played the banjo and died of pellagra or whatever. And I remember at the moment, I have no socialist tendencies at all, but like, however your mechanism is to lift people up, I was thinking would be generally considered a good thing. And I was thinking I have a good friend who was a missionary priest in Peru for like 50 years, and he was always trying to like help the Indians. And I would say to them, what are you doing? Like, what are you trying to help them? It's like, well, they need like medicine. They need this, they need that. And I try to get my mind around, I feel like we reach into the rural areas because we want them connected, that the system doesn't like them being out there autonomous and maybe even free thinking. But on the other hand, are they poor? Are they suffering? Like, is it wrong to pull them up? And then I started thinking maybe LBJ was wrong to, it was bad. It's a bad thing, because I do like culture. I do like that thing where I don't respect materialism, and I think it's totally valid choice to choose leisure and autonomy over image and wealth, like whatever you want. I don't, whatever you want. But I just wonder about, like, is primitive the same as poor? Are people who don't have money sick because of the you need it to access? It's kind of like a unwieldy question there, but if you got the gist of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a good question, and I think it gets down to these kind of fundamental values questions. What is life really about, and what constitutes a good life? And I think many people would say that some level of material comfort is at least a significant part of a good life, if not, hopefully most people would say it's not the most important thing. I think that to some extent poverty is a kind of social condition, and I think we need to be careful when we look at people who are not so integrated into the system and seem to be suffering, whether that's not some kind of byproduct. So, for example, the San, also known as the Kalahari Bushmen, are people who until recently have been quite unintegrated and living a fairly traditional way of life. And my understanding is that some of them still are, but most of them are not. And they were of great interest in anthropologists because of how they had lasted longer than most indigenous societies, living a relatively traditional way of life. And one of the things that was commented on was that they would sometimes go for long periods without, they would go through these lean times. But you find out later on that they were pushed by the surrounding state societies and agricultural societies into some of the worst hunting and gathering land. And
yes.
And then you also see, things like pollution and toxicity leaking into these places.
That's actually what happened to these Peruvian Indians, is that they started building fences kind of far away on the mountains and everything, and then the wildlife couldn't move around anymore.
Right.
And they all of a sudden became impoverished. And then you go to what I think is the fundamental question of all politics and ideology, is like, what is the origin of property rights? So do they have a right to like this huge amount of land because they have this inefficient, quote, lifestyle? Mm-hmm. But yeah, so yes, they were pushed out. And then what do you do?
Yeah, that seems to be the perennial rationale for larger statist societies antagonizing, relatively less authoritarian people. That's actually the same justification that was given frequently for the colonization of America and pushing out.
What else could
Indians.
They say?
Yeah, and it was the same with England antagonizing Ireland. Actually, they said, they're letting all this land go to waste, and so forth.
Oh, that's Irish. I'm a citizen of Ireland. I take personal offense at England's treatment of Ireland.
You're a citizen.
So yeah. Isn't that weird? My grandparents were Irish, although by my name and my appearance, you wouldn't believe it. And when I tweeted my joy at getting my kids' passports, like I guess there are some, I think there were trolls, but Irish isolationists who was like, you're not Irish. I'm like, well, payback's a bitch, buddy, because my ancestors came over here and were welcomed.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do care about that. But I think that is, of course, what they have to say about colonizing, because what else could they care very much. Like, that system cares very much for the strict adherence to property rights. And how can you violate that basic tenet? I mean, you had absolutely no right to come onto this entire continent. You have well, I guess you would say you mix your toil with the soil. But if there were people already there, so you'd have to say that be fruitful and multiply, which gets back to a question that I wanted to ask, which is do you think that that the population of Earth, 7 billion people, are absolutely, I mean, what would the population have to be to live the way you live? I mean, that's a big question.
That's a tricky question. One of the big figures in permaculture, he's now deceased, Robert Hart, who was, I believe he was British. Actually, I'm almost 100% sure he was. He, interestingly, also had anarchist leanings, as a few of the, as no small number of people in the permaculture milieu do. And Robert Hart argued that overpopulation was essentially a myth that was used to control us, and he did some fuzzy math, as one does, and came up with a figure that I can't recall, that was based on what he claimed was a kind of conservative estimate of the amount of arable land on the earth, and that total surface area divided by the number of people, and ended up saying, look, if we could all be doing this and could be surviving. I can't speak to that because I don't know. I just don't have the expertise to assess something like that.
But it doesn't seem, you couldn't dismiss that out of hand.
I wouldn't dismiss it out of hand. I also think ideally, what we would do is try to have a soft landing out of this. So what I would like to see, because I think it does take, it's going to take a huge psychological adjustment and a huge skills adjustment to move toward the kind of life way that I would like to see people having. And so ideally we would have a soft landing where people would, I think stuff like agorism, I think that's great. People trying to increase their autonomy on an individual level, a small group level, a kind of local, regional level, by doing more of this kind of stuff. And I think what that looks like for a particular person is going to depend totally on their context. It's not like there's some recipe book, but I think almost anyone could do a little bit. And what we would ideally have is a kind of deceleration and like a slow easing off of technology. You could use the kind of analogy of an addiction. If you're an extremely heavy drinker, rather than trying to go cold turkey, you say, okay, well, what if I only have X number of drinks this week, and then X -5, and so forth. And there are green anarchists who are hardcore primitivists who think the only true freedom and integration with the biosphere is a sort of hunting-gathering way of life. I don't think that's possible, because our biosphere is so damaged now. I just don't think that's possible. And I also don't think it's necessary. And we have a different world now. We have different people now. We have evolved since then, even though some people think that we haven't. And we also have this situation where plant genetics are just all over the place now. Like we have access to these plants from all over the world, and so do people all over the rest of the world. And so in some ways, like we could reforest the world in a way that would be new in certain ways. And I think that it will actually make it easier in some ways, because we have all these useful plants that were normally geographically isolated.
Let me ask you this. What practical advice would you give to an aspiring homesteader, somebody who I should say this, somebody who wants to start to learn to grow their own food, where would they start, in your opinion?
Okay. I think one of the biggest things is to really observe and think, and this is probably the advice people don't want to hear, but it's a combination of move slowly and experiment. So if you want to learn about the land that you're on, learn about, how many sunlight hours you get throughout the year, do soil analysis, which is not actually that expensive. They do it out of the university. I think it's the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I think it can be done on a home level. It's not terribly expensive, and sort of study and carefully consider things before you make any big moves. Because it takes a lot more work to undo mistakes that you make than to just take more time. But at the same time, experiment with small things. Like, don't fall into an analysis paralysis. Like, if you're curious about a certain number of plants, just try growing a small number of them, and it won't require this huge investment of time and resources, and you'll learn things really quickly by doing them and having things go wrong or having things go right. So there's a lot of, if you have an internet connection, which presumably you do if you're listening to the show, there are a lot of resources out there that are free. There's loads of stuff on YouTube if that's your thing. There are a lot of PDFs and that kind of thing if you're more of a reader out there. If you just start looking for permaculture, agroforestry, forest gardening stuff, you'll find lots of information out there. And I guess I would say also try to find people in your area who are doing things. We were talking about the social isolation beforehand. Well, a lot of people don't know people who have shared interests in their area, but the one thing that the internet is good for is actually arranging for real world meetups by, just joining interest groups. If you can find someone in your area who's already doing gardening or farming or permaculture, they will be a huge resource because they'll have already tried a lot of things. And then that way you'll start forming these social connections that are really important for resilience. Because, the only way I think that we're going to defeat the state is by, reforming cultures that exist outside of it.
Do you find that there are increasing zoning laws or other resistance? 'Cause I know you said that you haven't spent a lot of time digging into some of the bigger picture globalist plots, but there's UN Agenda 2030, there was Agenda 21.
Yeah.
But before that, there was Habitat 1 and Habitat 2. And Habitat 1 said they wanted to take all the arable land offline. They want people to own their own personal belongings, but anything that can grow something is just too valuable to be in the hands of individuals. And I kind of worry that they see that your philosophy as a threat, or even just, and their urge to do this sustainability thing, they will encroach on your liberty to do this just even on your own property.
Yeah, that's a good question. So is this part of, you're actually I went on the show, Free Markets Green Earth, Free Markets Green Planet, I think it's called, earlier this week, and they brought up the Agenda 2030 thing. So obviously I have to look into this because you're the second person to bring it up this week. Is part of this the idea that we're going to move everyone into the cities?
Yes. Yes,
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
you won't have. That's one of the things where they want driverless cars, because you won't own your own driverless car, so you won't be able to get out.
Oh,
You'll be in that system where everything's regulated. Even the buildings aren't going to have niches; they'll be under total surveillance all the time. And they tie. When you look at what the agendas are, you can see how it ties into a lot of the way the propaganda spins stories. So if you familiarize yourself with it, you'll probably bum a little bit. So maybe just stay in a happier place.
Well,
but it's not as laid out. Yeah.
Yeah, I think all knowledge is good if it's true.
Yes, I'm not
so,
afraid either.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I'm, even though I'm how do I put this? Even though I'm a Luddite, I'm also a little bit of a tech skeptic. Like, I feel like we see time and again that whether it's Elon Musk or someone else, what's his name, Ray Kurzweil, saying like, oh, all of this paradigm changing technology is right around the corner. It's right around the corner. A lot of times it doesn't quite get there. I've seen some stuff that the driverless car thing is not going so well, and it ends up being a more difficult problem to solve than they think it is. So sometimes I hear this stuff and I think, well, this is such hubris. It probably won't work the way that they want it to. It's extremely difficult to rationally plan societies from the top, even when you're doing this kind of fancy Rockefeller-style social engineering. So, on the one hand, I'm a little bit of a doomist who thinks that a lot of this stuff might start to crumble under its own contradictions. But I don't think that that's an excuse for passivity. I mean, I think we need to be doing as much as we possibly can. And what I would love to see is some kind of mass secession, withdrawal, agorism, decreased dependence on the dominant economy in the state, coupled with it starting to come apart under its own contradictions. As for what you're describing, I don't know enough about it to address it specifically.
Yeah. Well, you're answering my question. I'm thinking, what I'm hearing is we have time. And so if you were to reforest, if people did have, I don't mean reforest the whole earth, but like if you could carve out your own place, like a reservation that you might be able to grandfather yourself in and live side by side. And the reason I think that you're right, I am really afraid of like how fast the tech, the surveillance and censorship state is going. And I feel like once surveillance is perfect, any kind of resistance will be difficult, and maybe futile. But the fact that the propaganda machine is working so hard all the time, it makes me think that that is a mask for a deep sense of insecurity. Because if they really had the kind of control that I kind of worry that they have, I don't think they'd have to worry so much about what we think and getting our buy-in and pitting us against each other. So maybe there is time to grow a couple of pear trees.
Yeah. It's been very revealing, I think, to have seen this year, both in the Atlantic and the New York Times, articles that are explicitly sort of mask off, saying we need to ditch the whole free speech paradigm. We need censorship. It's very important. And I think that I agree, it shows a kind of desperation to move things as quickly as possible. And I'm not sure exactly what that's about. I struggle to understand it in some ways, because I feel like if I were on top, I'd be trying to move it by inches, as slowly as possible, so people don't even really notice it. So I don't know if that's an insecurity about the fact that old guard media seem to be dying, and there's so much alternative media on the internet that people are accessing, and so there's a kind of insecurity about control over official truth. I don't know if it's an insecurity about sort of American empire having various problems, if it's an insecurity about like hitting ecological limits. It's hard for me to say.
Well, I think wonder sometimes if it's a generational or intergenerational opportunity that they see that they've got this iGen rising where they've been weaned on their screen since they were babies. And I've made this connection before. My mother watches Fox News. My kids get everything from YouTube. I was there for the dawning of the internet, so I saw all the truth while it was sucking us into our addiction by thinking it was a good thing. And maybe they feel like this is the moment to kill off all the boomers and I mean, that's what they're doing. And then convince this generation that they're giving checks for sitting around plugging in and tuning out or tuning in, plugging in and tuning in, that they then take this opportunity to say, okay, everything's changing right now. You can't even keep up with all the changes.
I think that you're right about that, Monica. There's always two simultaneous methods that are going on that these propagandists and social engineers use. They use one, they try to legitimize what they're trying to push through. And then the other one is, like you mentioned a moment ago, Bellamy, they try and do it subtly outside of people's awareness so that ultimately one day people look around and it is put in place, but it doesn't really impact them because it didn't happen all at once. The legitimization process is exactly what you're saying. When they see the opportunity, when more and more people are okay with what they're trying to push through, they put that message out there and people start asking for it and start agreeing with what they're saying, and then they can usher it in faster.
And they'll push or pull on the things that are working.
Yeah.
They'll throw everything out there against the wall, and when it doesn't stick, they'll come back to that later.
Yeah, and I suspect what is
I cut you off.
coming down the pipe is some kind of universal basic income, as you were hinting at, Monica, which is just to kind of make you comfortable with the transition.
Yes, this is something that annoys me, is that they push the technology, they subsidize the technology. The Department of Defense puts so much into the universities building technology. Then they tell us that, oops, technology is taking all of your jobs. Here, we're going to give you payoff. But we paid for that technology that took our jobs. That chafes me.
Right. Sure.
So what do you, I will just kind of wrap up with this question of, do you feel like, or can you give some insight into how, as such a young person, you were willing to, I feel like you've kind of gone off the grid earlier than most people. And I wonder if there was an aha moment that maybe can help awaken younger people to, who kind of still have the time to make a good life out of it. Me, it would be an act of psychic exhaustion rather than, ennobling hope. And I want you to impart, if you would, something, that might attract people to taking control of their lives in that way, having some insight, even if it's just a book to read, a gateway book.
Okay.
Your invitation to desertion, perhaps.
Sure. I'd be happy for anyone to be reading that. I think that does kind of summarize the case as I see it. I mean, I wrote that a few years ago. I've read it a little bit differently now. I guess, I think I ended up doing this because I thought that it was the sort of right, and it's not as if I'm completely off grid. Obviously, I'm speaking to you through the internet. I mean, I have electricity at my house and stuff. But I guess I decided on this because I just thought, no matter what happens, we're going to need people who have built up autonomy outside of the normal economy, whether it's because the system starts to degrade and fall apart under its own contradictions. I mean, people are going to need food systems and knowledge, how to create those food and fuel systems and grow building materials and that kind of thing. If there ends up being some kind of civil war or sort of mass insurrection scenario, people are going to need this kind of thing. If we're able to, what I would like to see, the kind of soft landing withdrawal strategy, people are going to need to be doing that. And it's the kind of thing that basically I decided to do this and do media. Sometimes we think of doing the good as this kind of sacrifice, like, like you have to do the right thing, even though you don't really want to. I think that's a really backward and degraded morality. I mean, I think when you do the good, it makes your life better. And that's what I see myself doing. I mean, I'm happy doing what I do. I don't get up in the morning and think like, oh, I got to go, whatever the task of the day is. It's creative. You use your mind, you use your body.
I think those are the two things. I think you hit on the two things that are really appealing to the whole person, to a real human being, a three-dimensional human being, which is that it isn't just a series of chores, is how I kind of think of growing stuff. But first of all, the way you've cracked the code on that is, of course, brilliant and beautiful, but that it's an act of both a pursuit of knowledge and a repository of knowledge, building knowledge, which is very appealing to kids from what I see. That they really like that a lot. And if you pour garbage into their brains, they'll suck it up like a sponge. But if it's something inherently good, I think they recognize that. And being creative, I think, also is a need. And I'm not saying you just have to, like, finger painting, just whatever creation is. If it's a thought, you're a beautiful writer, Bellamy, beautiful writer. That is clearly an act of art. And I love it. And I can see that being very satisfying. And this repository of knowledge concept is so important. Someone recommended to me that I buy the Foxfire series just to have it in books. Have you heard of this, the Foxfire series?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's this repository of knowledge from, like, mountain people. I don't know if it's Appalachian or what. I just got it.
I think
it's this important repository of knowledge. And I think that it is inherently appealing, what you're saying, and that you're happy. I believe it.
In spite of
everything. So how can people learn more about what you're doing and kind of access your stuff directly going forward for our listeners? Can you give us a little rundown of what's the best approach?
Yeah, sure. I have a really shitty little website that's I'm going to be working on to make it a little better. It's bellamyfitzpatrick.com, and I'm going to be adding links to it and so forth. I started recently doing a video show with a friend who arrived at a similar position to mine by going through a right-wing path rather than mine. I went through a left-wing path. I don't really consider myself left-wing or right-wing. I think he would say the same, but he went sort of the other way and arrived at roughly the same conclusion. And that's called Liberty and Logos. We're on hiatus right now because he has a whole complex situation going on, but we're going to get back to doing it regularly. I have a blog on there, and I also do a journal called Backwoods that is a print journal, print only. And there are 2 issues out now, and I just created a new editorial collective to be working on the 3rd. And if you want to know about any of these things, I have a contact form on my website, and you can just reach out to me through that.
I have really enjoyed Liberty and Logos, so I hope that you guys get back to that. The funniest thing, I did have to give myself, let out a little chuckle as somebody emailed you and kind of started taking shots at fire, which I get it. Like, when you can just reduce the technology thing to absurdity, and then you answered, well, some people think that, like, gray matter was really our downfall. And any ability for abstract thought kind of separated us from our most natural state. Yeah. So you can get absurd. So I was actually glad that you pointed out that it does not have to be that way, that there can be something accessible and hopeful about it. And I absolutely love the idea that we have some time, and people, I think that there will be a critical mass of people who are awakened by what's happening here. It was very unnerving for me to realize how quickly the powers that be could just turn off the spigot of my most basic necessities. I mean, would not know how to get clean water. I mean, I couldn't survive 3 days. Mm-hmm. So that woke me up. I mean, not enough to get off the couch, because most Americans are getting paid to stay on the couch. They're probably going to not wake up anytime soon, but I think there are plenty of people will.
Yeah, and I wonder about this sort of normalization of universal basic income as a social control mechanism, because you get people dependent on it, and then you can just sort of, turn it off or decrease it or whatever as a way to punish dissent.
And then at that point, maybe they just start sterilizing people without their knowledge. I mean, what do they need them for? You know what I mean?
Yeah, sure. That I know is, I know in that sort of Rockefeller conspiracy world that I alluded to that I'm not familiar with, I know one of the recurring ideas that seems to come up in that circle is that they need to decrease the population to about 1 billion, which means, 1/7 of what it is now, right?
Yeah, let's hope that's a long-term and not a short-term plan.
Right.
As a mom.
Yeah, I just to touch on the what you brought up about the fire and stuff. Yeah, you can sort of rewind the technology thing as much as you want and sort of say like, oh, it was a mistake for us ever to have come out of the trees. I will say that there are some interesting essays. I ultimately disagree with them and think that they're wrong, but there are some interesting essays by kind of dissident public intellectual John Zerzan, who did look into the kind of almost as deeply as you can into looking at things like how does our concept of time function in an authoritarian way, and the way that we measure time. And some of it is very interesting stuff. So I'll just give a shout out to him.
Yeah. I actually did not mean to come off mocking at that, really, because I questioning assumptions is the one thing that could probably save us. Mm-hmm. That's the essence of propaganda. People don't question they don't question what's actually the propaganda on the surface, much less the underlying assumptions. Once you start questioning assumptions, it's a lot easier to understand what you know to be true and what you do not know to be true. And that's the beginning of true knowledge. So I respect the person who thought of fire. I didn't think about it. I hadn't thought of it. If I had thought of it, I would have written the email. Sure. But it is funny that you can just keep going back. But I would. That idea of time, yes, because then that connects to the kind of next dimensional thinking, which we might have to save for another time. And
sure.
I'll ask you about panpsychism next time if you'll do it. And I just love. I really appreciate your time. I love exploring your work. I think I might have to get your print publication. I do feel like that will be my step. That'll be crossing over the line. I will join you as a pre-tech Luddite.
Yeah, the water's fun.
Yes, I know. I believe it. So thank you so much, Bellamy. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope that people will visit your site. And I'm really looking forward to your next episode of Liberty and Logos.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bellamy.
Yeah, thank you.